Welcome to the BAPS Better Living podcast, and this is the Dharmic Life series, where we take everyday moments and find a deeper spiritual dimension to them so that we can find greater joy, happiness, and peace in our lives. My name is Dhaval, and I'm joined by my co-host Yogesh today. Yogesh, how are you today?
Well, I'm doing great, actually. Funny enough, knowing what we're talking about today, just a few days ago, I took my family to Sesame Place, a small theme park. My son was telling me, okay, Daddy, we're going to go on these big rides, but I need you to sit next to me. And if you sit next to me, it's going to be really fun. So I said, no problem. We could do that. But as soon as we got there, we were joined by a couple of friends who also had little ones. And so we're like, why don't you guys just pair up? And so instead of the adults going in, you guys could just have fun amongst yourselves. And all of a sudden, he started panicking. He's like, but if you don't sit next to me, I'm going to get scared. And I'm like, don't worry, your friends are there. Why are you so concerned? The same ride you were willing to sit with as long as I was there, now you just sit with your older friends. Um, and as I was talking, it was funny that like the advice I was giving him, I actually wasn't following it myself because I just know, even at work, anytime I'm given a new project, something new I've never done before, I tend to panic, or at least I have some nerves about how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? What if I can't achieve it? What if I can't deliver on time? And all these thoughts are racing in my head, just like it was racing in my son's head when he was concerned about the ride. And so it got me thinking, I'm like, we generally do become anxious when we're thrown into the unknown or we don't have control.
Yeah, I feel I've been going through that type of phase myself right now. Definitely relate. I think there's so much anxiety out there. I remember just recently, I've been going through a situation where we were going to move into a new place. My wife and I had picked out a new place, and through a variety of life circumstances, that place would no longer be appropriate for us. In a real state of panic, I was like, well, this whole thing is going to fall apart. There's going to be big penalties. It's not going to work out. And I felt a real sense of panic, a real sense of anxiety from this change of circumstance. And thankfully, everything is working out fine and it's all sort of getting resolved. But in that moment, for those 3 or 4 days when I was waiting for the responses to come back, I was in this intense state of anxiety. And I think overall, as a society, as my friends, I talked with them, family, there's this overwhelming sense of anxiety that I think has been bubbling up with time. Certainly, we're living in this age where the news is constantly at our fingertips. It used to be that you would just listen radio for an hour or something like that. You would read the newspaper once a day. But now it's with us at all times in our phones. So this feeling of anxiety that something could go wrong at any moment now is always with us. And I think it's worth exploring today about how anxiety kind of rules us and how spirituality gives us an answer, a way out of this sense of anxiety that's always with us.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're probably not as old as you mentioned. We probably listen to the radio in the car. To your point, the news came maybe in the evenings, once or over the weekend, but we weren't constantly bombarded with it, as you mentioned. Now with 24/7 news cycles, with social media always constantly also sharing what's happening at any given time, in any given second, in any part of the world, we're just constantly surrounded by negativity, if you will, because that is generally what is shared more than even positive news. And because of that, to your point, whether it's conflict, whether it's a war, whether it's a famine, whether it's children being malnutrition in a given part of the world, you always feel this level of anxiety or baseline anxiety, if you will, just because something is going on and you feel like there's not much you could do at that second to help alleviate that. Because of that, you do feel that concern. And to your point, we do have spiritual practices, hopefully a few that we could talk about today. But I will say, even with knowing some of those spiritual practices, it's difficult. It is difficult to face these issues on a day-to-day basis, whether big or small. It could be something at work, it could be something for your kids at school. And it might seem minor in the grand scheme of things, and yet it still seems very valid at that very point of time when it happens to us.
In that moment, what ends up happening for me at least is that, I've heard a lot of this advice out there that, just think positively, look on the bright side of things. And a part of me wants to accept that. But then another part of me says, well, it feels irresponsible to not worry about this thing that's happening in my life, or this thing that's happening in my community, or this thing that's happening to a family member, even though they might be on the other side of the globe. And the question becomes, how do we apply spirituality? How do we feel a little bit more grounded? Feels irresponsible to not be anxious about something or another. There's something that always is out of our control. And I wonder what spiritual insight can help us get past the other side. And I'm trying to look through some of our historical or Itihasic references, and the story that comes to my mind, which I think encapsulates this state of anxiety so extremely well, is the story of Arjun, the great warrior, and Krishna. So Arjun is
Yeah.
this great warrior from the time of the Mahabharata, which is one of the great Indian epics, and he's known as the greatest warrior of his time, the greatest archer of his time. And he's on the battlefield right at the start of this big battle, the battle to sort of end all battles. And in the middle of this, right at the start, he tells his charioteer, an avatar of the divine God, go to the center of this field because he wants to take a good look at the people he's about to face. And so his charioteer, Krishna, goes to the center of this field and he looks at all the people he has to fight and he gets anxious. Now, Arjun is someone who has faced tremendous challenges. He has overcome them again and again and again, and he's felt so much confident. He's such a confident person. But in this moment, the critical moment where everything really hangs on the balance, he loses trust in himself, he loses his confidence, and he becomes extremely anxious. And he says, I don't really want to fight this. I don't think I have it in me to fight this war. What should I do, Krishna? And I think about this dialogue so much because it helps me think about anxiety as well. Because I am Arjun in this moment. I am Arjun, you are Arjun. We're all Arjun in that moment. At some point in our life, in some battlefield of life, we're feeling anxiety. We're feeling that this is way out of our depth, that we're totally and hopelessly out of control. What do we do?
So I think a lot of times, as you mentioned, when we feel anxious, there's a level of guilt associated with it. We think that I shouldn't be feeling this way. Why do I feel this way? I'm a spiritual person. I go to my place of worship. Why am I feeling anxious? Is there a hole in my understanding or in my faith? But I think this example that you mentioned of Arjun is a perfect example because it shows it's okay to have anxiety. It's okay to feel nerves. It's okay to have that pit in your stomach because we're human at the end of the day. It's not a place where we've attained this state of nirvana, which is known in other religions, but we're going through it the here and now. And because of that, it's okay to admit when we are facing these things. The question is, what do we do after? And did the perfect thing. He went to the person who actually would be able to give him valid advice, valid reasoning about what he needs to do. And as you mentioned, it was really particular about one thing that Krishna Bhagavan, the avatar, the charioteer of Arjun during the time of the war. A lot of times we have our own perception of what is good, what is bad. We have our own perception of this is considered dharmic and this is considered adharmic or against dharma. And God told him point blank that put your perceptions of what you think is correct or what you think is dharmic and abide by what I'm suggesting or what I'm telling you to do. There is that specific quote in the Mahabharata, Sarva Dharman Parityajya, which is essentially saying a lot of times we think we know what we're doing, but in reality, we might not be fully understanding the true context of, in this case, what Bhagwan is saying or what, the scriptures tell us about how to live a dharmic life. But it reminds me of it's a silly example, but recently ran across an example of someone mentioning that what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And in this case, this is what Krishna Bhagavan is exactly telling us in this, that knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing you can't put that in fruit salad. And so the idea here is that put away your perceptions of what you think is good, what you think is dharmic, and follow and trust the words of God in knowing what are true and good actions.
And I think what that gives us is this sense of peace. It gives us this sense of conviction and a sense of letting go because we hold on to so many different things. And that's the ultimate message that Krishna is telling Arjun, that just let go. Surrender your conceptions of what things be and how they could be, and trust that I am looking out for you, that the path that I'm showing you is the right path for you. I think that's the most difficult part, right? To let go in that moment, to recognize that we don't have control.
Yeah.
But what Krishna is assuring Arjuna of is that not only are things going to be okay, but I'm looking out for you. And we know that throughout that war, there are countless instances where Krishna, even though he didn't really go out there and fight for Arjun with a bow and arrow or a sword or anything like that, he was still looking out for Arjun at every step of the way in ways that were completely invisible to him. And I think this idea gives us the conviction that whatever challenge that we're going through in life, whatever anxieties that we're facing, if we can learn to let go and trust that a higher power is guiding us, a higher power is looking out for us, and finally, whatever this higher power is doing it for our benefit. If we learn to start accepting that perspective, then life becomes a lot simpler. This anxiety that rules us becomes a lot easier to manage. And I can't think of a better example than seeing this in action in the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. In 1998, Pramukh Swami Maharaj went in for an angiogram. And at the end of this procedure, the doctors came out and told him that this is a very serious situation. He's sitting on a ticking time bomb. He's sitting on a volcano, and it can erupt at any moment, which means that Pramukh Swami Maharaj's heart was in a severely bad condition. Now, in a state like that, if I was in his shoes, a state of anxiety would just rush into me. I would be completely paralyzed by fear. I would be feeling so panicked about the situation at hand. But Pramukh Swami Maharaj took this in complete stride. He just asked, well, what's the next step? And the doctors recommended they need to do a bypass surgery immediately. And so Pramukh Swami Maharaj said, okay, well, let's just do it. And there was no anxiety in him at all because he, in that moment, surrendered completely to a higher power. He knew that whatever was happening was for his benefit, and he was able to really give a strong example of what happens when you let go and surrender to God. This state of equanimity that we're all looking for, this state of peace from the chaos of life, he lived, he mastered. And we're seeing that this teaching of Arjun and Krishna is something that's not abstract, but it's something that we can live. And that's what the story of a guru really tells us. I don't know if anything comes up for you as you listen to this story.
No, I mean, absolutely. It's almost a paradox. You would think to retain control, you have to grab it really tightly. But this example from Brahma Maharaj himself in his life and what we know about Arjun in his conversations with Krishna Bhagwan is you actually have to give up control and fully believe, as you mentioned, that God is the all-doer, this concept known as Kartapanu, that God is the all-doer. And if we have full faith in that, then you take all the anxiety, the pressures that you think you take on yourself when you're grabbing onto that, when you believe you're in control, you're actually relinquishing it. You mentioned the incident from 1998. 24 years earlier, it just shows how Prongsa Maharaj was the same from the beginning all the way to the end. That even in 1974, he was on his way to do his first major international Vicharan or spiritual tour around the world. And he was going to Nairobi. He gets there, there's a huge fanfare in India on his send away. And he gets there, he's sitting on the plane. And even before he could get off the plane, the immigration officers, due to some misunderstanding, wouldn't allow them to deboard and said, Prongsa Maharaj and party, you guys need to go back. And everyone was in a state of anxiety. All the senior swamis, the senior devotees who were there trying to receive Prongsa Maharaj, they're trying to anxiously make this work out. And here Prongsa Maharaj was sitting on a plane, counting his rosaries or doing Mara. And everyone asked Prongsa Maharaj, we're not going to be able to go. What should we do? He said, it's okay. It's okay. Whatever happens is God's will. And he kept on counting his rosaries or doing his Mara. And so to your point, Dhaval, it's kind of crazy that in order for us to feel that level of peace, we need to learn to let go, to understand, not just to let go, but to also understand that everything that's happening is for my good and it's happening through the all-doership of God. There's an example that Shashi Maharaj often would mention, the third successor of Bhagwan Swaminarayan for BAPS, that Prongsa Maharaj would often quote, that he mentioned that imagine you had a pot of water and you place it on your head. It's going to feel heavy, naturally. But now, say you dive into the ocean. You're surrounded by tons and tons of water all around you, and yet you feel no weight. And he mentioned that is the example for understanding God to be the all-doer. When you feel you're in control, it feels like the pot that's weighing you down. And when you know that God is doing everything, you could be in the midst of all this responsibility. You could be in the midst of turmoil. You could be in the midst of issues that are going all around you, and yet you feel a certain level of peace because at the end of the day, you have that full faith that God is the all-doer.
I love that because it tells us that life is happening for us and not to us. Quite often people have this question that why do good things happen to quote unquote bad people and bad things happen to good people? In some ways, this understanding helps us deal with what we perceive to be an injustice, an unfairness happening in the world, because we're able to surrender to this higher power and understand that everything that's happening to us is good. And it becomes our journey, right? This universe is a university for us to evolve and for us to grow and reach this higher state of consciousness, this state of enlightenment, this state of Brahmic realization, as you're talking about. And so, this understanding is so foundational, and yet it's sometimes so difficult for us to practice it. And I think that's a good place for us to go to next. How should we be practicing
Yeah.
these ideas in our life? What's coming up for you?
I mean, I think the first thing is sometimes taking a step back. I think a lot of times because we're on the move or on go go go, that it's hard for us to just stop and take a breath. And the reason for that is to almost stop and just think about the present. Almost live in a state of gratitude. Something that our gurus have expounded over and over again is that a lot of times what we tend to do, and this has especially exploded in the social media era, is that we're always looking at people who might be a little bit ahead of us, whether that's financially, intellectually, socially, and we're always wanting more. But they always mention, think about people that are unfortunately below us, whether, again, they might not have the same means as we do, they might not have the same career as we do, and almost feeling grateful that we actually do have a lot more than we tend to give ourselves credit for. And I think a lot of times when we do stop, and a lot of times if we put ourselves in that mind frame or that mind shift, if you will, then we go from a place where we're always wanting more and might feeling anxious that I didn't get that bump in salary, I didn't get that promotion, or my kids aren't getting into the best schools that I wanted to. All of a sudden, it goes into, you know what? We're actually doing good for ourselves. We're doing fine. God has given us enough. There's unfortunately people who don't have the same means as we do. And I think for me, that helps a lot when we almost pause a little bit and think about how lucky and fortunate we are and how much God already has given us.
Yeah, something that I'm leaning into a lot more are affirmations or statements that make these ideas more firm in my mind. I know right now there's a big push towards what's known as adivation, BAPS, which is this idea of
Yes.
act of memorizing and reciting these sayings and teachings of the great teachers, the great gurus, and Bhagwan Samnarayan himself. And these words of affirmation are sometimes strong. They help counteract the immense flood of negativity, the immense flood of anxiety that overwhelms us sometimes. Certain phrases that I listen to, that I read out loud, and I feel that, you know what? This divine power is not someone who's apart from me, but he's with me at all times. He understands me. He wants my life to get better. I'm not here to suffer my way through life. And so when I hear these quotes and when I memorize them
Mhm.
and I really reflect and respect upon them, they create this unshakable foundation that helps me feel just a little bit more secure. And in the beginning, I think this practice felt a little bit tedious to get up and memorize certain things, but
For
it's
sure.
the magic of it happens when I sit down and actually reflect on these sayings a little bit more. And when I do that, the depth of these teachings becomes so apparent that they form a real strong conviction inside of me. So that's really been helping me as well.
I mean, just to piggyback off of that, my kids are also participating in the Adivation and they're trying to memorize these various Sanskrit shloks or quotes from our various scriptures. And for them, to your point, it's a little bit difficult to put two and two together or to sit down at that moment to think about it, right? At the moment, it just seems like repetition for them. But funny enough, again, I was with my kids playing, something happened, they were arguing, and all of a sudden, my older son recalled one of the shloks that he memorized from the Satsang Diksha, which is something that was written by Mahant Swami Maharaj, the current spiritual leader of BAPS. And I was actually shocked. It was something that he memorized weeks ago, and yet for whatever reason, he was able to recall it during that argument. And I was trying to make him understand, can't do this. You guys are brothers. You got to love each other. Stop doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And he remembered that one quote. And I'm like, wow, a lot of times when we memorize these things, it might not be apparent at that moment what the meaning is or how well applied in our life. But when we most need it, it actually does somehow come back to us. This is something that has further strengthened my thought of why this is so important. That if my kid could do this, of course, it's going to happen to us. That these talks might be memorization right now, but slowly, slowly, they are planting those seeds that when we do need them in times of anxiety, when we need them in times of when we don't feel in control and we feel like the world is kind of slipping away from us, these talks help ground us back into some level of peace, of calm, and then going forward from that moment on.
I think finally, for me, when there truly is an anxiety that feels too overwhelming, uh, I have to resort to prayer. Prayer is a conversation with the divine. It's a conversation with the conviction that I'm being heard, I'm being listened to, and a response is coming my way. Um, Once we pray with that attitude, the whole relationship changes completely. I feel so much more refreshed and energized at the end of a prayer, of an intense prayer. I sometimes go to the mandir, the temple, and have a conversation, which is all a prayer is, a conversation with the divine. I really just pour my heart out. I pour out all these anxieties, all these fears that I have at the feet of the sacred, at the feet of the divine. And I feel so much lighter just from that conversation. So I think if we spend a little bit more time just praying, just having a conversation with the divine, with the knowledge that it's going to be responded to, then I think we can cross these daily anxieties a lot more confidently. And sometimes we tend to intellectualize everything. We tend to keep it in our heads. We tend to keep it inside of us. But sharing it and surrendering it is in some ways the greatest act we can do to get past these daily anxieties. It goes back ultimately to what Arjun was doing with Krishna. He was praying to Krishna. He was saying, "Here are all my anxieties. Please relieve me from them. Please help me overcome them." And Krishna responded in kind. And I think from both our lives and from the lives of countless people who have practiced prayer, they know that prayers get answered. And the divine is always listening, God is always listening, and they're responding. He's here to help us.
I mean, it seems ironical, as I mentioned earlier, but learning to let go is what, in fact, is going to help us control our emotions, our thoughts, our anxieties, and pressures. And so, understanding, letting go, understanding God to be the all doer is the key, at least in my mind, to peace and happiness.
And I think that's a great place to end today's episode about how to deal with anxiety. We hope these thoughts, these stories help you deal with your anxieties. And until next time, namaste.